Have you ever believed in a new beginning, only to have that hope betrayed overnight? A lone woman leaves everything familiar, boarding the last train with dreams of a decent family. But what she receives in return is deception, robbery, and cold fear in the Wild West. And in her darkest moment, she must make a choice. Continue to believe in humanity or give up everything to survive? Ask yourself, if it were you, in the vast sky and earth, with only the sound of the wind and the pain of betrayal, would you have the courage to move on? Or would you close your heart so that no one would touch your old wounds again? This is not just a story about a false promise, but a journey to find one's own worth, thanks to a man who lost everything and thought his heart could never open again. If you have ever loved, lost, or had to stand alone, then this story is for you. I invite you to join me on the journey of Eleanor Hartley and Joshua McAllister. If the opening touches you, please like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss this emotional journey. There was something unpredictable about afternoons in Dust Haven. The wind blew down from the northern cliffs, carrying reddish-brown sand that felt as dry as sandpaper on the skin. The June heat lingered on the cracked earth, making the town feel like it was suspended in a long, unreleased breath. The train that afternoon screeched to a halt. Sunlight streamed down through the dust-covered windows onto the small platform, highlighting the dust particles swirling in the air. Eleanor Hartley stepped down from the third carriage. Her pale beige dress was faded from travel, and the hem was dusty, but she tried to keep her back straight. One hand clutched an old carpet bag. The other held a letter she had read almost line by line. A letter written in kind words, careful handwriting, signed Samuel Turner, the man she believed she would soon call her husband. Eleanor took a deep breath. The western air smelled of hot earth, the sweat of passengers standing nearby, and rotting wood from the station porch. It was a strange smell, but not unpleasant. She had left it all behind in Missouri, the loneliness of the empty house, the murmur of relatives accusing her of being too picky, and the bitterly cold winters. She came here to start a new life, a life that, she hoped, would be welcomed. Eleanor set down her carpet bag and gently smoothed the thin shawl over her shoulders. Her heart was still beating fast with both hope and anxiety. She looked around. Dust Haven was smaller than she had expected. Just one main street, lined with small, wooden-roofed shops, and a few more sparsely built houses, standing still in the sun like waiting silhouettes. She thought, if Samuel Turner really is as kind a man as he says in his letter, maybe I did the right thing. A wagon appeared from down the street. Its wheels made a familiar rustling sound on the dry, cracked earth of the west. The sides were dark oak and worn. Two men sat in front. One was skinny in an old brown coat. The other was large, and his shoulders were broader than necessary. The thin man waved to her. "Miss Eleanor Hartley?" She started. "Yes, it's me." The thin man smiled a friendly smile, or at least it looked that way. "We're Turner relatives. Samuel sent us to pick you up." A sudden warmth spread through Eleanor's chest. Finally, things were starting as she had hoped. She nodded. "Thank you both. I was really worried. I got off at the wrong station." "Haha, no. Samuel is expecting you," the big man said, his voice rough but cheerful. "Get in the car. We're a few miles from his farm." Eleanor climbed into the wagon. As the car started moving, she turned back to take one last look at the station, as if to say goodbye to the old things left in her life. The road out of town was several miles long and dusty. The wind picked up as the wagon headed into vast sagebrush fields. The sagebrush, turning silvery green, rippled in the afternoon sun. Eleanor smiled slightly. Even though she had not yet met Samuel Turner, she wanted to believe that fate was opening a new door. A beginning. About half an hour into the drive, the car turned onto a smaller, narrower road, too narrow to be the road to a wealthy farm. Eleanor tilted her head slightly. "Is this a shortcut?" Her voice was soft, not wanting to doubt. The big guy replied immediately. "Yes, the main road is under construction. It's faster this way." But Eleanor couldn't help but feel something was wrong. The road was too empty. There were no fresh tire tracks. There were no barns in sight. The wind shifted, blowing harder, carrying with it a sound like wooden posts clanking against each other. Eleanor looked into the distance where there were rows of old tents, near the foot of the hill. The roofs were tilted, the wood scorched as if there had been a fire. She frowned. "This isn't a farm, right?" The two men looked at each other. The smiles disappeared. The carriage stopped so suddenly that Eleanor had to hold on to the edge. The thin man jumped out first, took her hand. His voice changed, cold as the shadow behind the warehouse. "Get out of the car, Miss Hartley." But Samuel. There is no Samuel here." The big man lunged down and snatched the carpetbag from her hands. "And you don't need to know any more." Eleanor froze. She felt something fall in her chest. Not wood, not wind, but it is the sound of broken hope. "What are you guys doing?" I came here by letter." "Letter?" The thin man sneered. "You think we care? Be quiet. No one wants to hurt you. If you cooperate." He rummaged through her pockets roughly. Her few possessions fell to the sandy floor. A handkerchief embroidered with her mother's name, an old Bible, a small purse of money she had saved for 2 years. The big man bent down and picked up the handkerchief. "Nice. Hand embroidered? Give it back to me." Eleanor rushed forward to pull, but her strength was no match for his. He pushed her to the hard ground, not hard enough to hurt her, but enough to extinguish any last hope. She sat up, her breathing ragged. "Guys, please, I just want to start over." "Then go ahead." The thin man shrugged. "We'll leave you here." "No thanks." They climbed into the wagon, turned it around, and drove away. The tires crunched over fresh footprints. Dust billowed up like a curtain over the distant town. Eleanor stood in the middle of the wasteland. The afternoon sun cast a long, thin shadow that seemed to disappear. Handkerchief stolen. Money lost. Future? Nothing clear. The wooden huts ahead were charred, their pillars showing like corpses of an ancient era. The slope behind the hill led into a land that stretched on forever. Eleanor felt the pulse pounding in her wrist. A thought came to her, weak and painful. "I guess I was wrong." She turned to look in the direction the wagon had disappeared, but only a faint trail of dust remained. No one knew she had come. No one was waiting for her. No one cared she existed. The wind blew harder. The West had always been cruel to strangers, but this cruel, Eleanor had never imagined. She sat down, trying to keep her balance with trembling hands. Her heart was pounding so hard, with fear, shame, and pain, that she thought it would melt into the hot ground beneath her feet. But Eleanor Hartley was never one to give up easily. Even in her darkest days in Missouri, she got back up and went to work. Still struggling with the pain of old losses, she leaned her head on her hand, closed her eyes, and tried to stay calm. "Someone will come," she said softly, as if talking to herself, or as if pleading with the heavens, or as if clinging to the fragile remnants of faith she had left. But before her eyes was only a vast void. The wind was blowing again. The sun was still hot, and Eleanor felt her legs go weak. She tried to stand, to take a few steps, but she couldn't. Everything was spinning. Her body swayed. Then she felt light as a leaf blown by the wind, lying motionless on the wasteland outside Dust Haven. The sound of the wind finally faded away beside her ears. Everything gradually sank into a soft, cold, deep darkness. Part of her whispered, "I don't want to die here." The sun was setting as Joshua McAllister rode his old horse, Cedar, across the land west of Dust Haven. The last light streaked the cracked earth with warm honey, coating everything around him with a thin layer of gold. Joshua tightened his grip on the reins, raising his eyes slightly to the low hills to the east. He was used to reading the movement of the wind, the color of the clouds, the smell of the earth. But today, something felt different. A vague feeling, a soft call. "Perhaps it is just my imagination," he said to himself. "The weather is changeable this season." But Cedar paused, his ears perking up. The old horse rarely reacted strongly unless something was truly wrong. Joshua tilted his head, listening. The wind rustled through the sagebrush. In the distance, a crow cawed a single cry. Then, a very small sound, like a ragged breath, like someone touching the ground and letting go. Joshua squinted, pushing his wide-brimmed hat up a little to get a better look. On the edge of the slope ahead, near the charred remains of the wooden huts from last year's fire, he saw a figure, motionless. "Jesus!" He kicked Cedar in the stomach. Asterisk. As Joshua drew closer, he saw clearly that it was a woman. Her dress was frayed, Her hair was wind-tangled, and her hands were dusty as if she had tried to catch herself before falling. The wind carried the lingering scent of sweat and fear, very faint but unmistakable as the scent of earth. He dismounted. His knees were stiff from years of work, but they held firm as he knelt beside her. "Girl." His voice was carried by the wind, hoarse and low. He gently turned her over. Her skin was warm, but his hands were as cold as well water in winter. The wind blew through her hair, revealing a delicate face, and one filled with pain and fatigue. Joshua touched her wrist lightly. The pulse was weak. But there. He breathed out, both relieved and worried. "Leaving myself here alone, it's—" He shook his head, his words unfinished. At 52, Joshua had seen his fair share of misadventures in the West. Lost women, tricked immigrants, even roadside robberies, which he intervened when he saw them. But the sight before him still weighed heavier on his heart than usual. Perhaps there was something familiar about her face, not in the sense that he had seen her before, but in the sense of someone who had endured much pain and still managed to stand firm, just like he used to. Joshua looked around. The tire tracks were fairly fresh. There weren't many arrows to tell from, but this disjointed pattern, not a good guy. He doesn't like to jump to conclusions, but his experience is rarely wrong. The wind blew harder. The sun touched the edge of the hill. There was no time. If she lay here overnight, the cold would kill her before the wolves. Joshua bent down, put his hands under her back and knees, and lifted her up. She was lighter than he expected, so light he worried she hadn't eaten in days. "Okay, just lean on me," even though he knew she couldn't hear. He placed her in the saddle before him, holding them both with one hand while guiding Cedar with the other. The old horse understood, walking steadily as if knowing it carried a life that needed saving. Asterisk. As they left the charred huts, Eleanor moved slightly, very slightly, like a breath between two breaths of wind. Joshua leaned down. "Can you hear me?" She opened her eyes, her vision hazy as if through mist. "Please, don't take anything else from me." Her voice was so weak that Joshua had to tilt his head to hear it. A pang rose in his chest. "No one took anything from you," he said slowly. "You're safe. I'll take you back to the farm." Eleanor tried to move, but immediately froze as if her whole body was fighting a fever. "The farm?" "Yes." He squeezed her hand, reassuringly. "No one will hurt you again." She closed her eyes, her eyelashes fluttering a little. Maybe she didn't believe it. Maybe she didn't understand. But she didn't resist. Joshua looked down at her hands. There was a bruise on one wrist, clearly marked with large fingers, the hand of whoever had held her too hard. He tightened his grip on the reins. A quiet, low, deep anger rose in his chest. Not the kind of anger that explodes, but the kind of anger that Western men often carry, the kind of anger that smolders, is quiet, but once it burns, it cannot be extinguished. "Whoever did this," he said softly, as if it were a promise to himself, "I will find out." Asterisk. A few more miles and Joshua's farm came into view. A 2-story, sloping roofed log house with a wide porch. Beyond that, a stable and hayfield. Not rich, but solid. A place built with love and hands by Joshua and his wife, Mary. The evening wind blew through his chest, bringing with it old memories. Memories he had locked away too deeply after losing Mary 4 years ago. He glanced at the woman leaning against his chest. The irony of the situation when he thought his heart would never open again. Life placed a stranger, fragile and desperate like this in his hands. Her hand suddenly squeezed his shirt. Joshua looked down. "Please, don't leave me," she said, her voice almost a whisper. Joshua took a deep breath, a long, heavy, warm breath. "I don't leave anyone in the wilderness," he replied, his voice hoarse but firm. "You are no exception." She leaned her head against his shoulder, no longer resisting. Her body softened, sinking back into fever or exhaustion. Asterisk. When Cedar stopped on the porch, the sky had turned a pale purple. Joshua picked Eleanor up, moving carefully as if she were fragile glass. He pushed open the door and led her into what had once been the living room, where the smell of pine and the old pages of Mary's books lingered. He laid her on the long sofa and covered her with a woolen blanket. The fire was lit so quickly that he was surprised. His body seemed to act on instinct, the instinct of someone who had cared for someone with all his heart. Eleanor opened her eyes again. Who are you? Joshua replied simply. Joshua McAllister, owner of McAllister Farm. She looked around the room, her eyes filled with confusion and uncertainty. Why? Are you helping me? He sat down on a wooden chair nearby. The firelight reflected off his tanned face and dark eyes. Because this is the West, he said slowly. This place is too harsh. If we let each other die, what's the point of living? She closed her eyes. A tear rolled down the corner of her eye. Then another. For the first time in months, she wasn't crying because she was scared, but because someone would listen. Joshua looked at that tear and felt his heart ache in a way he thought he had long forgotten. He stood up. A voice inside him whispered, "She needs more than a blanket." He headed to the kitchen, got warm water, antiseptic, and bandages. Returning to her, he gently lifted her hand. "Let me see the wound." She was too tired to refuse. But when Joshua touched her wrist, she instinctively flinched. "It's okay." His voice was low, slow, and quiet. "I'll just bandage it." She opened her eyes and looked into his. Not the kind of man who lost his patience easily. Not the kind who was rude. Not the kind who would take advantage of someone in a moment of weakness. Joshua McAllister has the look of someone who has known pain, known loss, and knows how to be gentle with the wounds of others. She exhaled, very softly. "Then let him take care of her." A warm silence fell over the room. Silence is sometimes the strongest thing. The first night at the McAllister Ranch passed in the thick silence of the West. Outside, the wind whistled through the cottonwoods, rustling like the footsteps of the dead. In the little log room, the flickering fire in the fireplace cast a warm glow over every object. Eleanor lay on the couch, her breathing more even than when Joshua had found her in the wasteland. But her pulse was still weak, and her face bore the marks of lingering fatigue. Her hands were pressed against her stomach, as if trying to retain the fragile warmth of the woolen blanket he had covered her with. Joshua sat at the table, not sleeping. In front of him was a pot of hot tea, steaming gently. He didn't know why he couldn't leave her and go to sleep like he usually did. Maybe it was the way she curled up in her sleep, as if the world would disappear if she let down her guard. Maybe because her eyes, when open, they couldn't hide the hurt. When closed, they couldn't hide the deep loneliness. Maybe because he himself was so used to loneliness that when he saw others fall into that abyss, he couldn't bear to turn his back. Asterisk. Around midnight, Eleanor stirred slightly. Joshua raised his head. She said very softly, "You are still awake?" Joshua approached, his voice low as if afraid of hurting her. "Just watching the fireplace. It's cold in the West at night." Eleanor looked at the fire for a long moment. Then she whispered, Thank you." A short sentence, but it sounded like it came from the heart. Joshua sat down on the edge of the wooden chair beside her. "I only did what had to be done." She shook her head slightly. "No, people can see someone in trouble, but that doesn't mean they'll stop." Joshua was silent. Her words were painfully true. "Who did this to you?" he asked. Eleanor bit her lip. Her hand clenched the corner of the wool blanket, the habit of someone trying to hold on to the last thing unbroken. "The men took me to Dust Haven. They said they were Turner relatives, said they would take me to the farm of the man I had written to." Joshua frowned. "Samuel Turner? There is no such person." Her voice trembled. "It is all a trap." A silence fell over the room. Joshua felt something tighten in his chest, not anger, but a strange, deep pity. He had seen many Eastern women deceived when they came west to find husbands, but hearing the story from her own mouth, it cut a deep chord. She continued, her voice weak but clear. "They took all my money, even the handkerchief my mother embroidered. They pushed me down in the middle of the wasteland and left." Joshua was silent, his hands clasped together. Eleanor added, her eyes on the floor, "I know, I was stupid to believe those letters, but at the time I thought, if I didn't take a chance, my life wouldn't be any different." She paused. "But I didn't think I deserved to die in this strange place." Her voice choked. Something rose in Joshua, a very old, very masculine, but not crude instinct. "Protection." "I'm sorry," Joshua said softly. Eleanor looked up, surprised. Why are you apologizing? You didn't do anything to me. Because you met bad guys right here on this land, he replied. Dust Haven should be safer than that. Eleanor looked at him longer. The firelight made her eyes sparkle not with beauty, but with emotion. Joshua stood up. I'll make you some ginger tea. It'll help bring down your fever. She nodded, saying nothing. He went into the kitchen, and within minutes the sound of boiling water and the clanging of cups and saucers echoed in the familiar rhythm of a house long without a woman. When he returned, he gently lifted her head. Careful, it's hot. She drank the tea in small sips. The heat of the tea spread, making her cheeks blush slightly. I owe you my life, she said. Joshua shook his head. No, you're just living up to your billing. Eleanor frowned slightly. I am not sure what I deserve anymore. Joshua looked at her with eyes as still as winter soil. You survived the wilderness. You fought until you fell. A woman like you is worth more than many women I have ever known. Eleanor clutched the blanket tighter, not because of the cold, but because the words were like a rope pulling her back from a depth she thought she could never climb out of. When she fell asleep again, more gently this time, less cringing, Joshua got up, took the oil lamp, and stepped out onto the porch. The western night sky was vast and starry, space so vast that it dwarfed human beings. But to Joshua, it was an old friend, someone who had seen him through the long years without complaint. He stood for a long time, looking out at the horizon. There, just a few hours' ride away, was the land where the swindlers often hid. Is it Jonas McCrae and Hank Doyle? He wondered. Two names he had heard a few times in Dust Haven. They were around, and no one really wanted to get into trouble. Cedar stepped out of the cage, tapping his hoof lightly on the ground, as if understanding what he was thinking. Joshua stroked its silver mane. Not now. Not yet. He knew he would. But first Eleanor needed safety, time, a place to find her feet, and he wouldn't let her be afraid another night. When he returned to the living room, Eleanor lay on her side, her hands under her cheeks. Her face looked more peaceful now, though still tired. Joshua adjusted the blanket around her. In that moment, memories of Mary flashed back to him, the image of the woman he had loved all his life, who had cooked breakfast every day in this small kitchen, who had chuckled at his clumsiness in caring for others. He whispered in his heart, Mary, if you were still here, you would have told me not to leave her alone. Not a replacement, not a compensation, but an act of one who understands the silent pain. He sighed and sat down on the chair. She was not fully awake yet, but someone was watching over her. And in the dwindling flames of the hearth, he knew, even if the wind changed, or old wounds suddenly flared, he would still be here, for her, even though she didn't know yet, even though he hadn't said anything, even though everything had just begun. Mornings at the McAllister farm always began with the smell of hot coffee and the sound of the wind sweeping through the porch. But that morning, everything seemed lighter, as if the little cabin knew a new soul needed the peace to heal. Joshua had been up since before dawn. He lit the fire and drew the curtains so that the light wouldn't filter into the living room, where Eleanor was still lying on the sofa. Cedar whinnied softly in the yard, and the chickens began to run around, looking for food. But Joshua didn't leave the house as he usually did. He just stood by the door, still holding a hot cup of coffee, his eyes occasionally glancing at Eleanor, not because he was worried she would run away, but because he wanted to make sure that when she woke up, she wouldn't have to face the same confusion as last night. The West is lonely enough. No need for another heartbroken person. As the sun rose behind the distant hills, Eleanor stirred slightly. Joshua put his coffee cup down on the table and approached. She opened her eyes, squinting slightly at the light, despite his efforts to soften it. Joshua asked softly, "Are you feeling any better?" Eleanor looked around, taking a few seconds to realize where she was. Then she gave a small nod. "I don't feel as dizzy as yesterday." Her voice was still hoarse but not shaking like the night before. Joshua handed her a glass of warm water. "Drink this. You are dehydrated." She took it with both hands, trying to keep calm, but Joshua could still see it was shaking slightly. He decided not to ask further. He understood that some fears were best heard in silence. "You were up all night?" Eleanor asked, her eyes fixed on him but her voice hesitant. Joshua shrugged. his voice relieved. It's not that bad. I'm used to sleeping little. She looked at him a little longer, her eyes filled with gratitude, mixed with a hint of doubt as she wondered why he was being so kind. But Joshua was not the type to be praised. He pulled a chair closer, sat down, and kept his voice even. Eleanor, I want to ask you something. Do you still have pain anywhere? Stomach, head, arms, or legs? She set her glass down, rubbing her bruised wrist. Just a little sore here, and a little headache. But I'm fine. Joshua didn't believe much in the word fine. He'd used it for years after losing Mary, a word he used to hide everything that needed hiding. But he did not force her to say more. Asterisk. As Joshua got up to prepare breakfast, Eleanor slowly sat up, letting her back rest against the soft pillows. She looked around the room, her eyes wandering over the old furniture, the oak chest with its few scratches, the faded hand-embroidered tablecloth, the picture frames face down, as if not ready to be looked at again. She knew immediately that this had once been another woman's home. There were subtle traces, the carefully folded corners of the curtains, the faint scent of mint in the room, and the precise placement of objects that only a woman's hand could achieve. He had a family once, Eleanor thought to herself, and the house still carries the breath of the deceased. A strange feeling ran through her heart, not jealousy, not envy, but respect for the figure who had lived here. A sudden feeling of gratitude rose in her heart for a man who knew what loss was, and didn't turn away when he saw another woman breaking down. She gently touched her wrist. The bruise was still there, darker than last night. An image suddenly came back to her. A sinister laugh, cold eyes, rough hands squeezing tightly. Eleanor shivered. Joshua saw it as soon as he entered. He put the plate of cornbread on the table and walked over. Are you feeling dizzy again? Eleanor shook her head so fast that her hair fell on either side of her face. I just remembered what happened yesterday. Joshua was silent for a few seconds. Then a deep, slow voice, hard as oak, but soft as wool. Eleanor, you're safe here. No one will find you. She looked at him, a look filled with the vulnerability of someone who had once bet his life and been betrayed. Are you sure? I'm sure, Joshua replied without hesitation. My farm is a few miles from town. No one comes through here without my permission. He said it with the calmness of someone used to protecting land, used to protecting what was his from the evils out there. Eleanor let out a shaky breath. She didn't believe life would be so easy, but the certainty in his voice was enough to hold on to. Asterisk. After breakfast, Joshua changed his coat and prepared to go to the stables. Eleanor watched him, then hesitantly called out, Mr. Joshua. He turned back. What? She pursed her lips. Hesitant, confused. I don't want to bother you. If you have something to do, just go. I can take care of it myself. Joshua studied her face for a long moment. He knew the type of person she was, someone who had survived on her own and was not used to having someone help her. He replied in a hoarse, deep voice, You're welcome. I'll just go to the stables for a bit. If you need anything, just call. Eleanor looked down at her hands. A thought crossed her mind. Why does a near stranger care so much about me? But she didn't ask, didn't dare ask, didn't have the courage to hear an answer she wasn't ready for. Asterisk. A few minutes after Joshua left the door, Eleanor stood up. Her legs were still a little weak, but she needed to move, to prove to herself that she was still alive, still in control of her body. She walked around the room. The morning light fell on her face, revealing soft yet strong features, the beauty of a woman who had suffered much but not let it break her. As she reached the corner of the cupboard, she lightly touched the hand-embroidered tablecloth. The stitches were clean, and even the work of skillful and patient hands. His wife, Eleanor whispered, must be a very gentle woman. She walked over to the bookshelf. There were a few old Bibles, some leather-bound diaries, and a framed photograph with its face down. She didn't touch the frame. There were things from other people's past that she felt she shouldn't touch, but she could feel something deep in this house, in the way Joshua spoke, in his silent gaze, an old sadness, a wound that has been cleaned but still leaves a scar. She understands that feeling better than anyone. Asterisk. When Joshua turned back, he found her standing by the large window, looking out at the sage fields that stretched to the horizon. Everything is so peaceful, Eleanor said softly. Joshua stood beside her, but kept his distance enough so that she wouldn't feel constrained. Yes, this land is peaceful. It's just people who make it chaotic. She nodded slightly. A silent understanding formed between them, no explanations, no long stories. Joshua tapped the doorframe lightly. Eleanor, I don't know what your past is. I won't force you to tell me. But here, you don't have to be strong all the time. She turned to look at him. His eyes were sincere, not curious, not judging. It had been a long time since anyone had told Eleanor that. She took a deep breath. Thank you. Joshua nodded slightly, a peaceful acceptance. Then he opened the door to the porch. If you have the strength, you can go out and sit for a bit. The wind this morning isn't too cold. Eleanor followed, each step still cautious. But when the door opened, she felt like she had touched another world. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and sage. In the distance, the lowing of cows mingled with the clucking of chickens. There was no threatening presence. There was only the wind, the blue sky, and the soft morning light. Eleanor closed her eyes. It felt as if some wound inside her, the wound of betrayal, of fear, of near death, was being soothed by this warm silence. Joshua stood beside him, saying nothing. And it was that silence that made Eleanor feel like she could breathe peacefully for the first time in months. The afternoon sun streamed down over the McAllister farm, spreading soft gold across the dry earth. A breeze from the northern hills carried the scent of sage, pine from the stables, and a little smoke lingering in the chimney from the early morning cooking. Eleanor sat on the wooden chair on the front porch. She wrapped a light towel around her shoulders and watched the movements of the farm, the chickens scurrying for food, the old cat curled up under the steps, and Joshua nailing a board to the horse stall. The sunlight shone on the experienced man's face, highlighting his strong features and deep wrinkles at the corners of his eyes, traces of years of work, years of loss, but still standing strong. Eleanor watched silently, an indescribable feeling rising in her heart. Not a frivolous emotion, not a casual admiration, but a very deep sympathy, because she saw in his posture stability in life, something she had been searching for many years but never had. Joshua looked up and saw her watching him. He nodded, then continued hammering away at the board. It was a simple yet rhythmic movement, lifting the board, adjusting it, hammering in each nail as if he had done it 1,000 times. Eleanor felt her heart skip a beat. Ever since she was deceived and came to Dust Haven, she had only seen cold eyes, brutality, and the cruelty of the world. But here in the familiar scene of noon on the farm, she felt her heart soften for the first time. She closed her eyes. The events of the day before still haunted her, but the memory seemed to fade in the face of this peace. Eleanor, Joshua's voice came from the courtyard. Could you come down here for a moment? I want you to try walking around and see if you're feeling better. She opened her eyes. Joshua was standing by the fence, looking at her with a mixture of worry and trust. Eleanor stood and walked down the steps. Her legs were still a little weak, but much better than last night. As she approached, Joshua reached out but didn't touch, just kept his hand there, in case she needed it. A small act, but it earned her the respect those con men never had. Go slow, he said. Eleanor nodded and took a few steps. She felt the wind on her face, the warm sun on her skin, and the faint smell of hay wafting from the stables. What do you think? Joshua asked as she stopped by the fence. I'm better, she replied, then smiled slightly. I forgot how nice the west wind is. Joshua looked at her, silent for a moment. The west wind is like the people here. Straightforward, no beating around the bush. But sometimes it can be bitterly cold. Eleanor chuckled. Are you saying I've already had that biting cold? Joshua did not smile back. He looked at her with such sincerity that one could not avoid. Eleanor, I know your fear isn't gone. Your body is healing, but your heart isn't. And it doesn't go away quickly. She bowed her head. You don't have to care so much about my feelings, Joshua. Joshua leaned his hands on the fence and said in a low voice, I don't see it as a burden. Anyone who has experienced loss understands that having someone who will listen to you is the most precious thing. She paused. The word loss made her look up. You used to, she said softly, hesitating as if afraid of touching something she shouldn't. Joshua turned away, looking out at the meadow where Cedar was leisurely grazing. Yes, he replied softly. My wife, Mary, died 4 years ago. Eleanor held her breath. A gentle breeze blew, carrying the scent of lavender from the potted flowers on the porch, a scent that filled the house with memories of the dead woman. Sorry, Eleanor said, sincerely. It's okay, Joshua replied. Loss is inevitable. What matters is how you live afterward. The words seemed to touch something deep within Eleanor. She felt a lump in her throat. If so, she whispered, I wouldn't have known how to live. At least, until now. Joshua turned to look at her. There was something quiet and strong in his eyes, like the way the earth can withstand a storm and still stand. He spoke very softly, almost loud enough for her to hear. You're still alive, Eleanor. And that was the bravest choice. She kept silent, but her chest ached as if a hand were gently squeezing it. Not pain, but something being lifted. Asterisk. They walked another lap around the yard. The sun was warmer, the wind calmer. When they returned to the front porch, Eleanor touched the back of the chair, relaxing her shoulders. Joshua asked, Would you like to try lunch out here? I'll reheat the stew from last night. Eleanor smiled slightly. Okay, I want to sit out a little longer. Joshua nodded and walked into the kitchen. Eleanor watched his back, a strange feeling rising in her heart. The feeling of being noticed by someone, not judging, not taking advantage, not pitying. It's just that kindness comes slowly, quietly, and very real. And that made her feel not invisible anymore. Asterisk. When Joshua brought out 2 bowls of hot stew, they sat on the porch, looking out at the rolling meadow. There were no words, just the sound of the wind and the light clink of spoons on bowls. After a while, Eleanor put down the bowl and hesitantly asked, Joshua, do you think, will they return to Dust Haven? Joshua put the bowl aside and answered bluntly, Maybe. Jonas McCrae and Hank Doyle are still around here. Eleanor's expression changed when she heard the names. She remembered them well, both their cold, knife-like gazes and their contemptuous smiles. She clutched the edge of the blanket in her lap. Do you think they'll look for me? Joshua looked at her so long that the wind stopped blowing for a moment. Then he replied in a firm voice, If they come here, they won't come a second time. Eleanor looked into his steady eyes, eyes that made her feel safe in a way she thought she would never feel again. For a moment, she believed he could do it, not because he was violent, but because he was a man who never turned away from injustice. She asked softly, Why are you so interested in my business? Joshua didn't answer right away. He looked out across the meadow, where the wind was stirring the sagebrush. Because I've been left behind, he finally said, and I know how scary it is. The words hit her like a needle piercing through the hard shell she had built up over time. Eleanor bowed her head, hiding her reddened eyes. Joshua didn't look at them, but he knew. It wasn't the first time he'd seen someone trying to hide tears, but it was the first time he felt the urge to wipe them away. He clenched his fists instead, not because he didn't want to, but because he understood. Her pain needed to be respected, not hastily soothed with intimacy she wasn't ready for. Asterisk. The afternoon passed in peaceful silence, but as they were clearing the dishes, the sound of horse hooves came from afar, strong, hurried, and with no intention of stopping politely. Joshua froze. Eleanor paled. In a moment, all the peace of the morning was shattered into the wind. Joshua put his hand on her shoulder. Go inside. Don't come out until I call. Eleanor shivered. Joshua, don't. Come in, he said, his voice not loud but sharp as an axe blade. She looked at him for a second, a very long second, then went back into the house. The sound of hooves was getting closer, very close. Joshua walked down the steps and stood in the middle of the yard, his face completely different from before, calm, cold, but not afraid. In the distance, 2 figures on horseback appeared. Then they became clearer and clearer. Jonas McCrae and Hank Doyle. The wind that was blowing also stopped. Joshua spoke softly, just enough for himself to hear. So, you guys really dared to return to Dust Haven. A dusty wind blew in from afar before Jonas McCrae and Hank Doyle even entered the farmyard. The 2 large horses, galloping so hard that dirt flew up behind them, seemed to shatter the afternoon peace Joshua and Eleanor had just enjoyed. Joshua stood tall in the middle of the courtyard, his feet planted firmly on the dry ground. His wide-brimmed hat kept the harsh sunlight out of his eyes, but not the seriousness in his ashen eyes. He kept both hands at his sides, not hurried, not threatening, but showing no fear either. Hot steam rose from the ground. A dry wind swept through the eaves. The air stretched taut like a bowstring. Then Jonas McCrae pulled hard on the reins, bringing the horse to a stop just a few feet from Joshua. "I'm impressed." Jonas smiled faintly, tilting his head. "I heard Mr. McAllister lives a peaceful life, growing grass to feed his cows. I didn't expect him to be so tough." Hank Doyle sneered, squinting around the yard as if searching for any sign of Eleanor. "Hey, Jonas, do you think the girl we dropped off at the station yesterday could be hiding in this house?" Joshua did not answer immediately. He just looked straight at the two men. His eyes were deep and cold, but not filled with death, but with the wariness of one who had seen war and understood the price of conflict. He spoke slowly, each word clearly. "What are you doing here?" Jonas shrugged. "Oh, we were just looking for someone. A pretty girl, brown hair, name, Eleanor something. She got lost. We wanted to make sure she was okay." Joshua replied immediately, his voice sharp. "It's nothing, and she's none of your business." Hank laughed. "Not under your control? Hey man, we're taking her to town. Take care of her. She's one of us." Joshua stood half a step further, slightly tilting his head. "If you really cared about her, you wouldn't have left her in the wilderness." Hank clenched his jaw. Jonas stifled a curse. The wind changed direction, blowing a few pieces of straw from the roof of the stable. Cedar in the stable lightly hit the door, sensing tension. Joshua lowered his voice, low and slow. "She was near death when I found her. Half a minute more and she would have died in that heat." Jonas curled his lips. "Really? Maybe she's just telling lies to please you." Joshua looked deep into his eyes, his voice cold. "She doesn't need to flatter anyone. As for you two, you're lying so poorly." Jonas was silent. Hank tightened his grip on the saddle. Not because they were afraid, but because they were not used to having someone older, calmer, see through them like that. Eleanor stood behind the door, her hand over her mouth to keep from gasping. She heard every word, the contempt in Jonas's voice, the determination in Joshua's, and she felt as if her heart were being squeezed. She worried about Joshua. The Jonas brothers were not people who knew when to stop. Asterisk, Jonas spat on the ground. "All right, get straight to the point. Where is she?" "It has nothing to do with you two," Joshua replied. "I'll ask again." Jonas emphasized each word. "Where is she?" Joshua didn't move, didn't dodge, didn't retreat. Just one sentence replied, making Hank standing behind startled. "In a place you have no right to go." The silence was long enough for the wind to rustle through the sides of the house. Jonas lowered his voice. "Do you think you can protect her forever?" "We don't have time to come here for a little money, Joshua." Joshua sensed the threat in every word. "Then what for?" Jonas looked at him, his eyes darkening. "She has something with her that we must retrieve." Joshua narrowed his eyes. Part of that wasn't true. She had nothing but a few odds and ends. But the awkwardness in Jonas's pause mid-sentence told him they were hiding something, bigger than a simple robbery. "She didn't bring anything," Joshua insisted. Jonas smiled, a soundless smile. "Yes, it's just, she doesn't know." Joshua stood up straight. "What are those things?" Jonas glanced at Hank. Hank sniffed slightly, then said, "Letters, plans, paperwork that could get us in trouble with federal law." "We're sure she has." Joshua interrupted. "She has nothing, and she knows nothing about you guys." Jonas sighed, looking reluctant. "Joshua, you are a good man, but sometimes good men die for others." Asterisk. Eleanor held her breath behind the door. Her heart was pounding, each beat pounding against her ribs. She didn't understand all of Jonas's words, but clearly, she had been tricked into something much bigger, something so dangerous that two people like Jonas were willing to cross any line. She tightened the door. Joshua. He was standing alone against two men who would stop at nothing, and the only reason he was doing so was for her. A tear fell onto the back of her hand. Asterisk. Outside in the yard, Joshua kept his voice calm. "You two go now. I don't want things to go too far." Jonas laughed. "So you think we'll follow your advice?" Hank pushed his coat aside, revealing the pistol at his side. Joshua kept his eyes on Hank's hand. Hank's fingers twitched, a familiar reflex when he was ready to draw his gun. No one spoke. No one waved an arm. But the silence between them was as tense as a rope about to snap. Then Jonas lifted the reins and threw back his head defiantly. "I'm going, but I'll be back." Hank spat on the ground again. "No girl gets away from us and lives." The two horses turned, dust billowing behind their hooves as they left the farm. Joshua stood still, his eyes following them until they disappeared completely behind the sand. No one said anything. There was only the sound of the wind blowing through the wooden fence. Asterisk. When he returned to the porch, Eleanor stood in the doorway. Her face was pale, but her eyes were bright in a different way, the way of someone facing an unwanted truth. "Joshua," her voice was soft, like a thread about to snap. "They could hurt you." Joshua took off his hat and placed it on the table. His face showed tension, but not fear. "I know," he said. "Then why don't you let me leave?" she said, cringing. "You don't owe me anything. I dragged you into this." Joshua took a step, just one, but enough for her to look up at him. "If I let you go, you will die." Joshua spoke slowly, but with the force of a hammer on an anvil. "I do not let women die in the fields. Not once. Not for any reason." Eleanor shed tears, not tears of fear. Tears of someone who had never been protected so calmly and resolutely. Joshua looked at her for a few more seconds, then said, "Eleanor, listen to me." He placed his hand on the wooden threshold, his voice as deep and sure as the ground he stood on. "They will come back, and when they do, I want you alive to face the truth, to know you don't have to run anymore." She looked at him, then nodded very slowly, like someone was giving her trust that she had never dared to give to anyone. The wind outside picked up again, but this time, it didn't take away their peace. It just signals that the real storm is coming. That afternoon, the wind blew so hard it threatened to tear the blue sky away. From the porch, the sagebrush stretched to the horizon, trembling like a lake about to stir. The dry air, the scorching sun, and the heavy air from the afternoon's confrontation made everything seem even more somber than usual. Joshua stood outside, one hand leaning against a porch post. He followed the hoof prints. Jonas and Hank had left a deep gash running through the otherwise peaceful land. Eleanor stood in the doorway, her hands gripping the wooden edge. She knew he heard her footsteps, but he didn't turn around. Joshua was like that. When faced with trouble, he chose silence first, the silence of a man who has endured. Not words to reassure himself, but silence to prepare himself. Eleanor stepped closer. "Mr. Joshua." He turned his head, his eyes deep and tired. "You don't need to go out. The wind is strong. I worry about you," she said honestly. Joshua raised his eyebrows for a moment, then his eyes softened. He leaned back against the porch pillar, arms crossed over his chest, not defensively, but as if trying to hide the anxiety inside him. "Eleanor, they came back because they thought you knew something." He spoke slowly, almost in a whisper. "Did you bring anything strange with you? Anything you didn't recognize?" Eleanor tried to remember, her eyelids fluttering. "I had a little money saved, a handkerchief my mother embroidered, a Bible, and a letter from Samuel Turner. That was it." Joshua nodded slightly. "That letter, do you still have it?" Eleanor shook her head. "They took it from me. I have nothing left." Joshua was silent for a few seconds. He looked out at the meadow, his eyes darkening. Maybe there was something they wanted to hide in that letter. Or it wasn't Samuel Turner who wrote it, but someone behind Jonas and Hank. Eleanor felt a chill down her spine. "You think I was tricked? Not just to rob her of her money?" "Maybe," Joshua said, his voice deep. "Maybe you were chosen to be a blindside, or to carry something away, or to cover up clues." She sat down on the porch chair. The words, each one piercing the fear she tried to hide. "Joshua, if that's true, I've dragged you into something bigger." Joshua looked at her for a long moment, so long that Eleanor felt like he was seeing through the layers of hurt she had hidden. "Eleanor," he said softly but firmly, "you're not dragging me into anything. I decided to keep you, not out of duty, not because I enjoy interfering, but because I knew If I left you, you would die. She bowed her head, her hands clasped together. Aren't you afraid? Afraid, he said honestly. I've lived long enough to know that only fools aren't afraid. But I also know this. He paused, then continued hoarsely. I'd rather face danger than let you go back out there alone. Eleanor's heart felt like it was being pulled by an invisible string. She didn't cry, but her eyes were wet. Asterisk. They sat silently for a while, listening only to the sound of the wind sweeping through the porch. A strong wind blew, pushing a few wooden boards apart. Joshua quickly stood up. Come inside. I need to check the stables. This wind could easily snap the mooring ropes. Eleanor wanted to follow, but knew she could do nothing but cause more anxiety. She just watched him walk quickly across the yard, the steady gait of someone more accustomed to dealing with nature than with people. She watched, her heart filled with conflict, afraid he was in danger, afraid she was the reason he had to face Jonas and his men, but also feeling, strangely reassured that he was there, a feeling she never dared to expect. Asterisk. After nearly half an hour, Joshua returned. His shirt was dusty, and a few wood chips clung to the shoulders of his coat, but his face was calmer. The stables are fine, he said, his voice almost a breath. Cedar is very nervous. He senses danger. Eleanor looked up. You're nervous too. Joshua laughed briefly, a short, low laugh, as if a small knot had been untied. Me? I'm just tired of those idiots. Eleanor stood up, her voice cautious. You must be careful. Jonas is not simple. Joshua stepped closer to her, stopping half a foot away, just enough distance for her to feel his strong presence, but not enough to make her feel pressured. Eleanor, he said slowly, you faced them in the most desolate of places, and you survived. You are stronger than you think. She smiled sadly. I am not strong. I just stand firm because I have no other choice. That's being strong, Joshua said. Standing up when there's no other choice, that's how the West survives. Eleanor looked at him, deeply moved. Joshua didn't know it, but his words seemed to touch a part of her no one else had ever understood. The resilience of someone who has survived loss. She sighed softly. You understand me better than I thought. Joshua looked at her for a long time, so long that she had to look away to keep from feeling her heart pounding too hard. Not that I understand, he said softly. It's just, I see what I used to have. Eleanor turned back, her voice soft. Your wife. Is she that strong? Joshua nodded slightly, his smile slightly sad. Mary is strong in a very quiet way. Like you. Eleanor bowed. She didn't want to compare herself to his dead wife, never. But she sensed what he meant. Respect. Sometimes silence is more powerful than any voice. Asterisk. Afternoon turned to evening. The sky was a coppery red, the light only the West possesses. Eleanor prepared dinner with what little she could, washing vegetables, arranging dishes, making tea. Joshua watched her from the table, not interfering, just observing silently. He saw the way she placed each plate carefully, gently, as if that little thing was what kept her alive. Dinner was quiet, but not awkward. They were just sharing a rare moment of peace before the night and worries returned. When Eleanor finished eating, she gathered the dishes and chopsticks, but Joshua raised his hand to stop her. Let me do it. You've been walking around a lot today. Eleanor wanted to refuse, but then nodded. She sat down near the fireplace, her hands clasped together for warmth. A moment later, Joshua entered the room, wiping his hands on a cloth. He sat down in the wooden chair opposite her. The fireplace burned quietly, its orange light dancing across their faces. Joshua spoke first. Eleanor, I'm going into town tomorrow. I need to talk to the sheriff. She was startled. You're going to tell them about me? No, Joshua replied. I will report Jonas and Hank. Eleanor clenched her fists. Aren't you afraid of their revenge? They don't seem like people who know when to stop. Joshua looked at her with a calm but determined gaze. I have lived here all my life. I will not let two criminals come and destroy the peace of this land. She bowed her head and said softly, You did this. For me? Joshua did not answer immediately. He looked at the fire for a moment, then said, I did it. For justice. And because you don't deserve any more pain. Eleanor's heart clenched. Not from pain, but from the feeling of being seen, really seen for the first time in years. She said softly, almost in a whisper. "Thank you, Joshua." Joshua nodded slightly. "Stay here. I'll sleep in the living room tonight, right by the door. No one can enter this house while I'm standing." She opened her mouth to protest, but looking at his eyes, she knew she couldn't change his mind. Some people speak with words. Some people speak with their eyes. Joshua, he spoke with the way he stood in the world like an oak wall. Asterisk. When Eleanor went to bed, she stood for a long time by the window. The meadows outside were covered with purple shadows. The sky was so vast that a man could disappear into it if no one knew he existed. She closed her eyes and thought, I don't know why, but here, with Joshua, I don't feel invisible anymore. Asterisk. Joshua spread a thick blanket in front of the front door. He placed the pistol beside him, not to be aggressive, but to be ready to protect. Before lying down, he looked toward Eleanor's room. The door was closed slightly, giving her enough space, enough for him to hear if she called. Joshua leaned his head against the wall and closed his eyes. For the first time in months, he felt less cold. Not because the house has changed, but because someone in it is trying to live again, and he knew tomorrow would be challenging. But for that brief moment, he allowed himself to believe that things could be better. The next morning, before the dew had even cleared from the sagebrush along the road, Joshua saddled Cedar. He tightened the reins, checking the saddle one last time, slow, steady movements. The mark of a man who knew what he was about to do. Eleanor stood on the porch, holding the woolen scarf Joshua had given her the night before to her chest. She looked at him, trying to hide the anxiety that was rising like a wave. "You have to be careful." Her voice was soft, but not trembling. Joshua nodded. "I'll be back before sundown. You don't need to come back so early." "I want to go home early," he said, his eyes never leaving her. "I don't feel safe staying alone." The words were simple, but made Eleanor lower her head to hide the feeling of warmth rising in her chest. Cedar sneezed, urging. Joshua climbed onto the horse's back, then paused for a moment, speaking in a low voice. "If anything unusual happens, fire the gun I have hanging in the kitchen. I will hear it even from a distance." Eleanor nodded, her hand clutching the edge of her shawl. He turned the horse's head, urging Cedar toward the red dirt road that led to the town of Quiet Creek. She stood there for a long time, until Joshua's figure was just a small dot in the middle of the vast grassland. Asterisk. The road into town in the morning had the familiar peacefulness of the West, the sound of horse hooves hitting the dry ground, the sound of wind blowing dust into long streaks. But Joshua's mind was as restless as the scenery. He looked around. The practiced instincts of someone who had lived half his life in open fields made him more attentive to every trace. Broken branches lying across the road, strange new hoof prints, and a slightly unnatural silence. Still, he urged Cedar into town. Asterisk. Quiet Creek wasn't big. Just a few rows of cabins, a tavern, a grocery store, a blacksmith shop, the sheriff's office, and the small church at the end of the road. But today, the atmosphere is different. People avoided his eyes. A few murmurs passed. "Crawford is here. Has he heard?" "I don't think so. Man, things are a mess." Joshua took off his hat and walked into the sheriff's office. Asterisk. Sheriff Owen Miller was a man in his late 50s, with a potbelly, sharp eyes, and a tired appearance. He was sitting behind his desk, a cup of strong black coffee in his hand. The smell of coffee mixed with the smell of old paper, creating the stuffy atmosphere typical of a border office. Seeing Joshua enter, Owen sighed deeply. "Joshua, I guessed you would come today." Joshua stood up straight, his whole body radiating the calmness of someone who had decided to face everything. "Jonas McCrae and Hank Doyle came to my farm last night." He spoke slowly, each word distinct. "Sheriff, I want to know exactly what they are wanted for." Owen tapped his fingers on the table. "Sit down." "No need." Owen took a deep breath, as if preparing to let go of something heavy. "Joshua, do you remember that Silverton case last year? The Turner house was broken into, the father was killed, and his documents disappeared." Joshua frowned. "Samuel Turner? The Northern Soil Surveyor?" Owen nodded. "Yes. He was investigating land fraud and forgery. He was close to finding evidence when he was assassinated." Joshua stood still for a few seconds. "You mean Jonas and Hank were part of that group?" Owen continued. Now there's something worse. They're suspected of not only killing Turner, but also of using his name to deceive others. Among them, he looked uncertainly at Joshua, is the girl on your farm. Joshua clenched his fists. Eleanor. She had walked into the storm without knowing it. They wrote to her using Turner's name? He said in a deep, heavy voice. It's possible, Sheriff replied. This is a bigger deal than you think. They use women as bait. When the victims have no one waiting, no one to protect them, they have an easy time. Joshua put his hands on the table, his eyes dark as the sky before a storm. Sheriff, what are they looking for in her? Owen shook his head. I don't know for sure, but there's a rumor that Mr. Turner hid some map, something that could prove the land scam. They were afraid someone else would find it. And Jonas thinks Eleanor has it? Joshua asked. You get the idea. Owen sighed. They think she knows too much. But really, she's just a victim. Joshua clenched his jaw. He blamed himself, even though he knew it wasn't his fault. Sheriff, Joshua said slowly, his voice like a hoe hitting dry earth. I want to protect her. But I also want to know. You have to answer honestly. Is there anyone in Quiet Creek who is on their side? Owen was silent for too long. Long enough for Joshua to understand the answer. Yes. Finally, Owen said. Joshua, you know, they couldn't have survived this long without someone backing them up. Joshua took a deep breath. He didn't ask more because he knew Owen wouldn't dare say if he did. A great war is coming. Not just with Jonas and Hank, but with the darkness that lurks in this town. Joshua put on his hat and turned around. I will take her out of here, if necessary. Owen called after him. Joshua, be careful. They are desperate, and desperate men are more dangerous than hungry wolves. Joshua looked straight out into the street as if looking at a shapeless war. I lost someone once, he said softly, but sharply. I won't let it happen again. Asterisk. When Joshua left the sheriff's office, the sky had darkened. A strong wind whipped up dust. Wooden signs creaked ominously. He walked through town, his eyes scanning every corner. A few people followed him furtively. A man in a wide-brimmed hat stood near the blacksmith shop, eyeing him dangerously. Joshua could feel it. The darkness was following him back to the farm. He mounted his horse, turned Cedar around, and spurred it out of town. There was no time. He needed to get back to Eleanor before someone else came for her. Asterisk. At the farm, Eleanor was carefully brewing a pot of hot tea. She tried to do something to make time pass faster, but every time she looked out the window, her heart felt like it was constricting. Dusty road, long grassland, leaden sky. She said to herself, he will come back, he promised, but a bad feeling still arose in her heart. Asterisk. Joshua rode so fast that Cedar was panting and sweating, but half a mile from the ranch, he stopped. Something is wrong. The wind changed direction. A flock of birds suddenly took flight from the bushes to the west. And the farmhouse door opened. Joshua jumped out of his saddle. Eleanor. He ran across the yard, gun in hand. And then, in the kitchen, there were signs of a struggle. A broken ceramic vase was on the floor. A chair was overturned. Small handprints were on the edge of the table. Eleanor! His voice was hoarse. No one answered. Joshua looked out the back door where strange shoe prints led into the clearing. In that moment, he understood immediately. They were there first. And Eleanor was taken away. Joshua gripped the gun tightly. His breath was as heavy as dirt on a grave. In the cold, empty house, a storm had just begun. The wind whipped across the roof, carrying dry dust that prickled at his skin. Joshua stood in the middle of the chaos, his eyes as sharp as a knife cut from a whetstone. Not a sound, not a breath except his own. But the clues told the tale. Eleanor didn't leave on her own. She was dragged, tugged, and taken out the back door. On the ground, the ceramic vase she used to hold tea yesterday was broken into two halves like an unfinished cry for help. Joshua bent down and touched the broken piece lightly. It still had the warmth of the morning. Or was it the warmth of Eleanor? He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. You bastards! His voice was just a hoarse breath. Joshua walked quickly to the back door, his eyes scanning the ground like a seasoned hunter. There were large boot prints on the ground, at least 2, maybe 3. Eleanor's footprints were small and close together, indicating she had been held tightly. There was a smear of mud from her left shoe. Someone had dragged her a short distance. Joshua stood up straight. His chest heaved violently, not from fatigue, but from a burning anger. No one was allowed to touch that woman that way. Not while she was under his roof. Not while she was trying to start her life over. Joshua went back into the house, grabbed his Winchester rifle, and tightened the belt around his waist. He tucked a long knife into his belt, something he hadn't used much since Mary died, but he needed it today. Before leaving, Joshua looked around the house one more time. Its emptiness pierced his chest like an invisible knife. The signs Eleanor left, the napkin dropped under the table. The chair shifted. Her hand gripping the wood all seemed to be calling to him. "I'm out there somewhere. Please don't leave me." Joshua put on his hat. "Eleanor, I'm coming." Asterisk. The clearing west of the farm was not dense, but tangled enough to hide the steps of those who wished to remain hidden. The wind still whistled loudly, stirring up dry leaves and dust. But for Joshua, a man born in the wilderness, that did not deter him. The footprints were still fresh. The ground was still sunken. The broken leaves still had fresh sap. They were just a little older than him. Cedar followed closely behind, occasionally lifting his head to sniff. That horse was always sensitive to the scent of strangers. Joshua rubbed its neck gently. "Good, old friend. We'll take her home." He bent down again to a hollow spot. A bit of green cloth was caught on a thorn bush. Eleanor's shirt. Joshua clenched it in his palm, his eyes flashing with a steely light. Asterisk. The sound of a branch breaking softly echoed from afar. Joshua stopped, raising his gun. A dark figure loomed between the trees. He crouched down and advanced. But when he approached, it was only a startled doe that had run away, leaving a trail of dust. Joshua let out a heavy breath. He put a hand to his forehead, trying to clear his head. "Don't let anger get the best of you. Don't make mistakes. Eleanor needs you to be clear-headed." Asterisk. Suddenly, the dirt road leading deeper into the woods changed direction. The footprints became thicker, more messy, as if there had been a struggle. Joshua walked faster, until he saw a handkerchief fell on the dusty ground. It had an E embroidered on it in silver-gray thread. Eleanor once said it was an heirloom from her mother. Joshua picked it up, touching the still warm edge of the towel. He closed his eyes and took a deep breath, letting the rage flow through him without overwhelming him. "She's alive," he said softly but firmly. Cedar tossed his mane, in confirmation. Joshua mounted his horse and urged it to run. Asterisk. After nearly an hour of tracking, the forest began to thin out, revealing a low-lying area below, once a dry stream bed during flood season. Joshua stopped his horse at the edge, watching. There were 3 figures in the distance. One of them was dragging someone with their wrists bound. Long, auburn hair fluttered in the wind. Eleanor. Joshua felt his heart being squeezed. They were leading her toward an abandoned shack, a place that local people had long rumored smugglers used as a staging area. They thought no one would come there. They don't know Joshua is different. He was not afraid of the deep forest, not afraid of the dark, not afraid of 3 men with guns. But he feared only one thing: arriving too late. Asterisk. Joshua assessed the terrain quickly. The dry stream bed formed a low belt of land. If he circled west and followed the cliff, he could approach from above undetected. He jerked the reins. "Come on, Cedar." The horse understood, moving lightly like a wild cat. Minutes later, Joshua stood on the edge of the slope, looking down at them. Jonas McCrae, dark hair tall, was talking to the man behind him. Hank Doyle stood beside him, grinning like a drunkard. And the third man he had never seen before, short, stocky, with tattooed arms. They tied Eleanor's hands with rope and pushed her into the shack. Eleanor staggered, but she managed to keep her back straight. Though gagged, her eyes were bright and alert, not the eyes of someone desperate, but of someone waiting for an opportunity. Joshua whispered, "Good. Eleanor, don't give up." He checked the bullets. The gun was loaded. The knife was at his side. His heart was heavy but not pounding. This was no longer a matter of the rights and wrongs of a farm. This was the life of a woman he had come to care about, more than he dared say. Asterisk. Joshua cautiously moved down, hiding behind a large tree trunk. From below, Jonas's voice echoed, "This girl is more stubborn than I thought. Check her again. Whatever Turner left behind must have been with her." Hank replied hoarsely, "If we can't find him, kill him like the others." Joshua heard every word. His head was burning like hot coals. You guys first. So Eleanor wasn't the first victim, and not the first to be brought here. Joshua gritted his teeth. No, he wouldn't let her be another checkmark on their list. Asterisk. He crawled down the slope. The distance was 200 feet. Then 100. Then 60. The wind was blowing against them an advantage. Joshua raised his gun, aiming straight at where Hank was standing by the door. But before he shot, Eleanor looked up. Her eyes, though, from a distance met his. She shook her head slightly, very slightly. Almost no one else saw it. Joshua lowered the gun immediately. She was saying, "Don't shoot. Something's wrong." And when he looked closer, he saw what she saw. The third man was standing close to Eleanor, but he held something in his hand that Joshua couldn't see. Something small, made of black metal. Not a gun, not a knife. Is it a small lock or a piece of steel? No, something like a mailbox key. Joshua frowned. Key? Key to what? Eleanor turned her head, deliberately leaning so Joshua could see better. He looked closely. The fat man held a small piece of paper folded in half. He held it out in front of her. Jonas shouted, "Tell me, what did Turner give you?" Eleanor shook her head vigorously. Her voice was muffled, but her denial was clear. Joshua strained his eyes. The writing on the paper, he could make out a few lines. The ink was smudged, but familiar. It's Eleanor's handwriting. What papers does he have of hers? Or, the truth dawned on Joshua like thunder. They weren't looking for what Turner had hidden. They thought Eleanor had a clue, but actually, they hidden it in her things, or in her luggage, or in a letter addressed to Samuel Turner. An elaborate cover-up plan. Eleanor had no idea she was carrying vital evidence, but now he was sure she had nothing. And that meant, they are going to kill her. Joshua couldn't wait any longer. He pulled the trigger. The loud explosion tore through the air. Joshua's gunshot rang out like a bolt of lightning that tore through the evening sky. The crow perched on a nearby branch took flight in panic, its shadow cutting through the late afternoon light, sending an eerie echo through the clearing. Joshua's shot was accurate. Hank Doyle staggered, clutching his pierced bicep. He screamed and cursed, dropping the gun he was holding. Jonas McCrae spun around at once. "We're being ambushed. Get down, quick!" The fat man pulled Eleanor close, using her as a shield. He pressed the metal object in his hand to her neck. This time Joshua saw clearly. It was the tip of a small knife, used to cut ropes or pick locks. Eleanor gasped, her shoulders shaking, but her eyes were brighter than any fire in that forest. She looked straight at the slope, knowing Joshua was there. She did not cry, did not scream, just looked at him with eyes that said, "I believe you." Asterisk, Joshua rolled to a large tree trunk, avoiding the bullets Jonas fired back. He cocked the gun, breathing deeply. The wind smelled of damp earth. The air was as tense as a frayed string. He heard Eleanor struggle to keep her composure. He heard Hank swear. He heard Jonas command, his voice spiteful, "Check to see if she has anything Turner is hiding. If not, kill her." Those words made Joshua clench his jaw painfully. In that moment, he no longer saw the three robbers. He only saw Mary, his wife, taken from him by illness. He would not let fate take Eleanor too. Not again. Joshua caught his breath, trying to steady his mind. He told himself, "Don't let your emotions blind you. Stay calm. Stay calm to save her." Asterisk, Jonas and Hank quickly found cover near the shack. The fat man still held Eleanor, forcing her back against the wooden wall. He shouted, "Crawford, I know you. Put the gun down. You're not getting out of here." Joshua replied in a voice as deep as a rock, "Let her go. She is innocent." "No one is innocent," Hank screamed, trying to wrap a cloth around his arm to stop the bleeding. "The woman you're protecting is bait. Turner gave it to her." Joshua raised an eyebrow. "What do you think she knows?" Jonas smiled coldly. "She has the evidence Turner got. The topographical map of the North District. The original. We have to get it back before someone else finds it." Joshua's frown deepened. "But she has nothing. We'll check it ourselves," Jonas growled. The fat man pulled Eleanor's hair hard. She whimpered in pain. Joshua held his breath, his whole body frozen for a second filled with a primal fear he hadn't felt since Mary's death. Then, he exhaled softly, but his eyes darkened like a storm gathering in an instant. "She doesn't have what you want," Joshua said, his voice cold as ice. "Then she's useless," Jonas replied. "Hank, keep her." He did not finish his sentence. Joshua fired a second shot. Asterisk. Hank fell. The bullet grazed his other shoulder, making him scream as if he was torn. Jonas immediately took cover behind a wooden crate and returned fire continuously. The fat man dragged Eleanor back into the shack and locked the wooden door. Joshua knew he had to change position. He slid down the slope, keeping close to each large tree trunk, listening for any noise as he moved. The forest was suffocating. The sky darkened quickly. The golden twilight, like burning fire, swept across the tree trunks, casting shadows as long as the arms of a dead man. Joshua felt his heartbeat strong, steady, but full of pressure. Eleanor is scared. "Hold on, Joshua. She needs you." Asterisk. As he approached the cabin, Jonas's voice rang out from inside. "Have you checked his pockets? Check his shoes, the seams, everything." The fat man replied, "Nothing. This girl doesn't know anything." "Then kill it." Eleanor shook her head vigorously, making gurgling sounds through her gag. Joshua tightened his grip on the Winchester. He put his hand on the stock, then slowly lowered it. He switched to his knife. He couldn't risk a shot. The fat man was too close to Eleanor. "You have to go in. You have to get close." Joshua took a deep breath. The night air was starting to feel cold on his skin. "Mary, if you are here, give me some strength." He went to the back door, thin wooden panel, rusty hinges. One strong kick is enough. But before he could act, Eleanor's voice rang out clearly for the first time. "No, don't." Joshua froze for half a second. Was she trying to signal something? There was a clanking sound. Then Jonas roared. "What is this?" The fat man shouted. "In his shirt!" "I found this." Joshua heard the rustling of papers. The next second he said, "The Turner letter. Here it is." But wait. His tone changed completely from triumphant to confused. Jonas asked, "Well, is there a map?" The fat man replied, his voice trembling, "Mr. Turner." Signed, not Turner, but Turner. He said nothing more. Joshua heard Jonas rushing forward. There was a brief struggle. Then Jonas shouted, "Give it here." In that moment Joshua knew it was time to charge. He stepped back half a step, gathering strength. Bam! The back door flew open like a storm, knocking down a fence. Joshua rushed in. Asterisk. The scene before his eyes was chaos. Jonas was snatching the paper from the fat man. Hank sat down in the corner of the shack, shaking with pain. Eleanor was tied up, slumped against the wooden wall, her eyes frantic but still bright, as if to say, "You're here at last." Joshua did not wait any longer. He hit the fat man hard with the butt of his gun. He fell like a sack. Jonas turned. But before he could pull the trigger, Joshua lunged forward, blocked the barrel, and spun around, jerking violently. The gun flew out. Jonas punched Joshua in the face, a punch so hard that the corner of his lip bled. But Joshua did not flinch. He grabbed Jonas by the collar and held him down. The two men wrestled, banging on the wooden wall with a loud bang, the sound of cracking wood, heavy breathing, and screaming. "Let her go!" Joshua roared the roar of a cornered animal. Jonas laughed, though he was trying to escape. "You love her, Crawford? Some raggedy girl you picked up from somewhere." Joshua punched him. Once, twice, then a third, harder. Jonas staggered and fell. Joshua snatched the knife from Jonas's belt and turned to cut Eleanor's bonds. She fell into his arms. Joshua hugged her, his voice trembling slightly, the first time Eleanor had heard Joshua tremble. "Eleanor, I'm here. I'm here." She wanted to say something, but her throat was choked. Only her tears fell on his shirt, not out of fear, but out of relief. But because she knew there was someone who chose not to abandon her. Asterisk. But as Joshua helped her up, a clanging sound came from behind her. The fat man, the one who had just fallen, was raising his pistol. Blood was dripping from his mouth, but he was smiling maliciously. "Looks like you really love me." Joshua spun around. Eleanor shouted, "Joshua, watch out!" But the next sound was not a gunshot. It was the sound of wood breaking right above their heads. A crossbeam, rotten with age, suddenly collapsed. The old shed could not withstand the struggle. The beam fell straight on where the fat man was standing. He screamed and was crushed under the heavy pile of wood. No more moving, no more sound. Joshua stood still for a moment, pulling Eleanor aside. He held her close to his chest, his breathing still rapid. Eleanor breathed out shakily. Are you okay? Joshua looked at her. His eyes softened, losing their familiar hardness. I'm fine, as long as you're fine. She leaned against him. For a brief moment, amid the cold wind and the smell of rotting wood, they stood close together like two survivors of a storm, finding each other in the ruins. But outside the shack, there was a loud sound of footsteps. Joshua immediately turned around to support Eleanor. Oh no, there are more than 3 of them. Eleanor took his hand, firmly for the first time. Joshua, you won't leave me. I know, he replied, his voice low and firm. I swear. He grabbed the paper Jonas had been fighting over the mysterious evidence and pulled Eleanor toward the door. Outside, a figure is approaching. A new storm is about to begin. The sound of footsteps echoed from outside the shack, heavy and steady like a storm drum. Joshua leaned over, pulling Eleanor against the wooden wall on the left, the strongest place among the rot. The night wind had changed direction. It was no longer blowing from the north, but from the west. The sunset was fading, leaving only a streak of orange at the end of the sky, casting long, slanted shadows on the ground. Eleanor trembled but did not panic. She clutched Joshua's sleeve, not for help, but to keep him close. Joshua bent down and whispered very softly, Are you okay? She nodded, not enough breath to speak, but her eyes gave him the strength he needed most at the moment. Absolute faith. He put his hand on her shoulder and squeezed it gently. Then Joshua stood up, glancing through the cracked wood of the shack. There were at least 4, maybe 5 men approaching. Dusty clothes, wide-brimmed hats pulled low, guns at their sides. Not townspeople, not the group Jonas had seen before. A deep, hoarse male voice spoke. Jonas! Hank! Where are you 2? Eleanor inhaled sharply. Another band? Joshua nodded slightly. The gang is bigger. I guess they followed Jonas to get the Turner paper back. She backed up against the wall. So this is bigger than I thought? Joshua looked down at the crumpled paper in his pocket. Much bigger. Eleanor. Outside. The crowd stopped in front of the shack. Another voice spoke up, full of anger. No movement. Go check. Joshua Quay, sang Eleanor. We have to get out of here. Go back, through the door I broke earlier. But if they see, let me take care of it. He helped her to her feet, as light as a shadow. Eleanor could feel his breath against her ear, low, steady, but quicker than usual. Joshua was clearly on edge too. They crept to the back of the shack, where pale light filtered through the broken wall. But just as Joshua was about to take Eleanor outside, a small sound stopped in the wind. A soft moan. Eleanor turned around. The fat man Joshua thought had been crushed by the beam was moving. He groaned, blood pouring from his temple, but one eye was open and looked at them. There was something in that look that wasn't hatred. But is it fear? Joshua paused. He approached slowly, gun raised cautiously. The fat man tried to breathe, his lips trembling. Don't shoot. Eleanor hid behind Joshua's shoulder, but she noticed something strange. His voice did not sound like the voice of someone who had just tried to kill her. His voice trembled, like someone with a secret that needed to be told before it was too late. Joshua knelt down beside him. How long does he have left? Eleanor whispered. Not long, Joshua replied. The fat man tried to turn his head. You are Joshua McAllister, right? Joshua was stunned. You know me? The fat man coughed up blood and smiled faintly. I'm not like them. I followed them because I had nowhere else to go. Joshua kept his voice low but sharp. Then tell me why you came here. He winced in pain, then pulled a small object from his shirt, the key Joshua had seen hiding on the slope. He placed it in his trembling palm and held it out to Joshua. The key to the Turner mailbox in Silverton. Eleanor covered her mouth, her heart pounding. The fat man continued, his voice urgent. They thought the girl knew where Turner hid the map, but actually, Turner mailed it right before he was killed. Joshua frowned. So Eleanor didn't know anything from the beginning. The fat man shook his head weakly. No, they used her. As a diversion. She was just an excuse. To track down who received the letter. He took one last breath. In that mailbox is proof that they embezzled land. From the northern corners of the forest. Real people's land. Old soldiers' land. And the ringleader. Wasn't Jonas? He took a sharp breath. As a town guy, Joshua felt a chill run down his spine. Who's in town? Sheriff Owen? The blacksmith? Someone else? The fat man added in a whisper. My name, Lester Pike. I don't want to die like a villain. Please, protect her. McAllister. Then he stopped breathing. Eleanor turned away, choking. Though he had threatened her, his last moment was that of a repentant man. Joshua placed his hands over Lester's eyes, closing them. A quiet, simple act, but human. Asterisk, Joshua, Eleanor called softly. He turned back. We cannot let him die in vain. Joshua nodded. We'll take this key. We'll go to Silverton. She looked up, worried. But what about them out there? Joshua tucked the key and Turner's note into his shirt. His eyes were sharper than steel blades. We are not going this way. He took Eleanor's hand and led her to the right wall where the strong wind made the leaves rustle, masking the sound of their footsteps. From here they could circle around the rock cluster and head straight into the deep forest, taking a detour back to the farm or taking temporary refuge. But as soon as they left the shack, a shout rang out. There they are. Eleanor held Joshua's hand tightly. He pulled her running, following the slope down a small path. Gunfire rang out behind. Bullets hit the tree trunk, the ground. One grazed Joshua's shoulder. Eleanor cried out softly. You were shot? Just graze. Run. Cedar, the faithful horse, was tied not far away. Startled by the sound of gunfire, it neighed loudly. Joshua pulled Eleanor closer. To reach Cedar is to live. They plunged through the sagebrush, the leaves cutting into their skin like tiny knives. Cold wind whipped at their faces. Dust rose in clouds. The footsteps of the pursuers were getting closer. Eleanor tripped, but Joshua caught her. Come on! Just a few more steps. Cedar appeared, its eyes wide, burning. Joshua lifted Eleanor into the saddle first, then climbed in behind. He jerked the reins. Come on, old man. Run. Cedar shot up, strong and fast as an arrow just released from a bow. The wind whistled in their ears. Eleanor clung to her horse's neck, while Joshua turned and fired back to keep the others from getting too close. In that moment, amid the sound of bullets, screams, and howling wind, Joshua realized he's fighting not just to save Eleanor, but to protect the second chance at life that fate has given him. And Eleanor, leaning against his chest, felt it too. She closed her eyes, letting Joshua's warmth embrace her from behind. The western night began to cover them like a heavy black blanket. But in that blanket, the flame of hope never went out. Cedar ran as if it knew the fate of the two people on its back hung between life and death. The wind whipped against their faces, reducing the space behind them to a dark blur of clearings and the shrill screams of their pursuers. The night sky fell quickly, the vast western darkness that could swallow up all sound and all trace in an instant. Eleanor leaned against Joshua's chest, feeling his strong breath. Joshua kept one arm around her waist, the other holding the reins, his sharp eyes piercing the night. When they were a good distance away from their pursuers, Joshua tugged gently on the reins. Cedar, slow down. That's good. The horse slowed down, breathing heavily. Joshua looked around, listening for every sound. No more footsteps, no more gunfire, just the sound of insects and the wind rustling through the dry branches. Are they still chasing? Eleanor asked softly, her voice still trembling slightly. Joshua placed his large, warm hand over hers on the saddle. They've lost it, but they'll find us. Tomorrow morning or sooner. He took a deep breath. We have to go somewhere they don't expect. Eleanor bowed her head, trying to calm herself. But then, she felt Joshua's shoulder wet. You're bleeding. She turned and touched his shoulder lightly. When her hand returned, black blood stained her fingertips. Joshua waved his hand. It was just a scratch. I'm fine, but his breathing was heavier than usual. You need to rest. At least, clean the wound. Eleanor said in a more determined voice, no longer afraid. Joshua looked at her for a few seconds, a look that was a mixture of emotion and surprise at her determination. All right, let's go to the South Creek. The water there is clean, he said, his voice low but gentle. Asterisk. They walked down the path, neither of them speaking. Not because they didn't want to, but because they both knew what had just happened was too big, too heavy to explain right away. The night was getting deeper and deeper. The sky was full of stars, but the starlight was hidden by the wind behind long strips of cloud. The stream appeared a small channel running between the banks, the water so cool and clear that it reflected the swaying shadows of the trees. Joshua dismounted first, then helped Eleanor down. The two of them reached the stream. Joshua sat down on a rock, took off his coat and shirt. Eleanor looked at the wound on his shoulder, a long gash, bruised but not yet dry. She dipped a washcloth in cold water, wrung it out, and pressed it to his shoulder. Joshua didn't groan, just closed his eyes for a second. If it hurts, just say it, Eleanor whispered. I can take it, he replied, his voice hoarse but calm. She wiped the wound carefully. Her fingers trembled, not from fear, but from an emotion that was hard to name, worry, gratitude, and something warm that went beyond mere affection. As the water flowed over the wound, she whispered, Why? Why did you risk so much to save me? I'm just a stranger, a troublesome person. Joshua opened his eyes and looked at her, his gaze so deep, it made Eleanor feel as if she were being seen through. Not because you are a stranger, he said slowly, because you do not deserve to die. And you do not deserve to be treated like an object. Eleanor bowed. His words were as soft as a breath, but touched a pain she had hidden for years. She spoke so softly that the sound of the stream almost swallowed it all. I have never been protected like this by anyone. Joshua looked at her longer. A pang passed through his eyes, not pity, but the empathy of one who had known loss, who had known loneliness. Eleanor, you have lived alone too long, he said softly. She smiled sadly. You too. Joshua paused. That statement hit home what he had been avoiding all these years. He turned away, looking at the black water shimmering with stars. Images of Mary flashed through his mind. Her gentle smile, her hands spinning, her afternoon embroidery by the window. Then the last image, him standing by the sickbed, helpless. Eleanor noticed the change in his eyes. She said nothing more. A warm silence fell between them, the silence of two souls that had suffered too much. Asterisk. After cleaning the wound, Joshua put his shirt back on and sat leaning against the rock next to her. Eleanor asked. Jonas said, the Turner letter was a forgery. But why send it to me? I am just a stranger. I don't know anyone. Joshua took the crumpled piece of paper from his pocket and handed it to her. See for yourself. Eleanor gently opened it. The paper was smudged and torn at one corner, but she still recognized the handwriting burned into her memory. The handwriting from the letter she had received before boarding the train to Quiet Creek. There was a sentence that made her cry. I need you here. I know you are the only one who can save me. They played to your weak point, Joshua said. Eleanor clenched the paper. My weakness is that I want to be needed. Joshua looked at her, his eyes very gentle. That is not a weakness. She looked up, her eyes wet. What is it? It's a good heart, he said. And bad people always take advantage of good hearts. Eleanor choked. She turned away to hide the falling tears, but Joshua saw them. He said nothing more, just sat next to her. His presence was enough to make her feel that she was no longer alone in this big, cold world. Asterisk. After a long while, she asked again, And the key? The mailbox? All this. Where does it lead us? Joshua looked west, where the town of Silverton lay behind the hills. If the map Turner talked about was in the mailbox, it would be great evidence. It could expose not only Jonas, but also the person behind it. Eleanor shuddered. The one in town, the one Lester was talking about. Joshua nodded slowly, his eyes as heavy as the night sky. It could be someone we know, someone who seems harmless. He squeezed her hand lightly. I'm afraid. This is more than just a gang of robbers. Eleanor touched his hand. You won't leave me alone, will you? Joshua tilted his head, looking into her eyes, eyes that were a mixture of fear, hope, and faith. I told you, he said low, steady, and deep. I won't leave you. Never. Eleanor let out a small breath. Not relief from safety, but from knowing she had found refuge. Not in his strength, but in the kindness and steadfastness within him. Asterisk. After a long pause, Joshua said, We have to get out of here. We can't go back to the farm just yet. They'll figure it out. So, where to? Eleanor asked. Joshua looked south to where the low hills led to the small wooden house where Mary had stored her weaving tools. A place Joshua had not been to since the day she died. There is a place, he said slowly. No one knows. No one thinks of it. Eleanor looked at him for a long time, then nodded. I go with you. Joshua didn't say thank you, nor good. He just held out his hand. She placed her hand in his for the first time without trembling. They mounted their horses together. The western night opened before them wide, deep, full of danger, but also full of hope. For the first time in many years of loneliness, Eleanor felt, maybe I'm not lost anymore. As for Joshua, in the sound of the gentle wind blowing through his collar, he thought to himself, maybe it's time I stop running away from the past. Cedar neighed softly, then slowly walked into the darkness. Inside that darkness, a new horizon awaits them. Cedar led them through a silvery moonlight. The western night had a way of making people feel small, but tonight, Eleanor and Joshua felt something else. An invisible closeness that connected two souls who had endured too many years of silence. The path to Mary's cabin had been untended for nearly 8 years. The grass was calf-high. The rocks in the shadows seemed to watch their every move. Are you cold? Joshua asked softly as they dismounted. No. Having you here is enough. Eleanor smiled very slightly. Those words made Joshua pause for a moment, then take a deep breath, as if just one peaceful word was enough to make his heart ache because he wanted to protect this woman for many more years. The house appeared in the night small, with a sloping roof and wood darkened by time. The windows were old and broken, but the frames still held the spirit of the woman who had lived there. Joshua pushed the door open. The hinges made a dry, creaking sound, like time knocking on the past. It was dark inside, but when Joshua lit the fire, a warm yellow light filled the room. Everything appeared like a still picture. A broken loom, Mary's rocking chair. The unfinished shawl lay on top of the loom. Eleanor stepped lightly over, placing her hand on the dry wool. You didn't say this place was so familiar. Joshua stood still for a long time. This place, I locked it away since Mary died. I didn't dare go back. I kept thinking if I went back, I would be dragged back into the old pain. Eleanor turned to look at him. His heart opened to her, bit by bit, like this door old, but still strong enough to open again. No pressure, no rush. Just standing together in the silence they both understood. Asterisk. Joshua put the gun on the table, then opened the package Turner left behind. The key, the ink-smeared piece of paper, and Turner's letter in shaky handwriting. If anyone finds this, drop it off at Post Office number 14 inches, Silverton. Inside is what I've been collecting for years, evidence of who's behind it. Eleanor pursed her lips. Box 14. We have to open it. Joshua nodded. But we have to wait until morning. It's dangerous tonight. Eleanor sat down in the chair across from him. The firelight reflected off their faces, two survivors of life's loss. After a while, Eleanor asked, Joshua, are you scared? Yes, he replied without hesitation. Afraid of what? That the truth in that mailbox could be the thing that changes everything, could touch the people I once trusted. Eleanor looked deep into his eyes. Trust is not something that is easy to gain, but sometimes losing it is not so bad, because it gives you the opportunity to trust the right person. Joshua bowed his head, his fingers tightening around the edge of the table. He understood what she was saying and to whom. Both were silent. The silence of two people who had been strong all their lives, but tonight allowed themselves to be a little weak. Asterisk. Early in the morning, with dew still on the grass, and the sun just a thin line above the horizon, they rode Cedar into the town of Silverton. A small town, but it has a gloomy atmosphere. Not because of poverty, but because of its own secret. When they arrived at the post office, Joshua looked around and then nodded to Eleanor. You keep the key. Turner gave it to you. Eleanor stepped forward. Her hand shook slightly, but she did not hesitate. The key turned with a soft click. The mailbox door opened. Inside were more than just a few pieces of paper, but a thick, carefully tied file, an envelope with a wax seal, and most importantly a notebook with familiar handwriting. Turner Wilkes. Eleanor opened the envelope first. Inside was a map. Not a map of the land, but a map filled with illegal shipping routes. Joshua squinted. A line. Human trafficking. Eleanor continued, her voice low and choked. In the notebook, Turner wrote down every name he found, every location, every transaction. On a page near the end, Turner scribbled, the ringleader, no one expected, the most respected man in town, the one everyone trusted. Joshua paused, as if something was squeezing his heart. Eleanor turned another page, and then both were silent. The name of the head is clearly stated, Sheriff Arnold Fraser, the man who greeted Joshua every morning, the man who helped Mary deliver goods, the man Joshua trusted the most, the man who protected this town for 2 decades. Joshua closed his eyes. He sank down on the bench in front of the post office, his shoulders heavy. Eleanor stood still for a few seconds, then gently sat down next to him. He said hoarsely, I don't want to believe it, but Turner never writes nonsense. Eleanor placed her hand on the back of his hand. Sometimes, the truth is scarier than we think, but you don't have to bear it alone. Joshua opened his eyes and looked at her. For the first time, the pain of many years in his heart surfaced, not of Mary, but of the wound caused by betrayed trust. Eleanor helped him up. Joshua, you have a choice. Either pretend you don't know, or face me. Joshua took a deep breath. His chest heaved. Then he placed his hand on hers for the first time without shaking, without hesitation. We face it, he said firmly, together. Asterisk. An hour later, they stood before the Silverton County Sheriff's Office, where the highest law in the region was held. Not sheriff. Not the one who betrayed everyone. Joshua knocked on the door. Sheriff Randall opened the door, surprised to see them arrive so early. As Joshua placed the book, the map, and all the evidence on the table, he said only 4 words. You must act. Randall turned each page. The more he read, the paler his face became. Oh my God. I didn't think this could happen. Joshua replied, his voice harsh. Nobody thought so. But now you know. Eleanor stood beside Joshua, not taking her hand off him. Not because she needed him, but because she knew he needed her too. Randall closed the file. I will send a telegram to Cheyenne at once. Sheriff Fraser will be arrested today. Joshua nodded. Eleanor breathed a sigh of relief. Not relief from safety, but relief from the knowledge that some truths, however painful, needed to be brought to light. Asterisk. On the way back, Joshua led the horse on foot. Eleanor walked beside him. Are you okay? She asked softly. Joshua looked out at the sun-dappled dirt road. Not completely, he said honestly. But I feel lighter. Like I can finally breathe. Eleanor smiled fondly. You deserve it. Joshua stopped. He turned and looked at her for a long time. After all they've been through, all the loss, all the silence, all the lonely nights. He said what his heart had wanted to say for a long time. Eleanor, you brought peace back into my life. Something I thought I had lost forever. Eleanor touched his hand. Joshua, I'm not a miracle. It's just, I understand the silence you carry. Joshua squeezed her hand gently. And I understand your loneliness. The western wind blew through, carrying the smell of earth after rain, the smell of wind from distant grasslands. Eleanor said softly, we have all been betrayed, but if you want, we can start over. Slowly, Joshua bowed his head. In the morning light, his eyes were so warm that it made Eleanor want to cry. Slowly, he whispered, but never apart again. Eleanor rested her head on his shoulder. This time, there was no shaking, only peace. Cedar stood by, silent, as if understanding that these two had finally found their destination. In the vast sky of the west, where the wind blows freely and the earth and sky hide nothing, 2 people who had been hurt found something simple and precious, peace, and someone to share it with. Eleanor and Joshua's story reminds us that, no matter how much loss life throws at us, the human heart has the ability to regenerate. We older people understand this better than anyone. Living long does not mean losing hope. but understanding that hope always returns when we least expect it. Silence isn't weakness. Sometimes it's how we heal ourselves, how we hold back our strongest parts before we're ready to open up again. And when trust is betrayed, we don't need to run away, we just need to find the right person to walk with. In later years, the most precious thing is not material things, not fame, but the feeling that someone really sees you and considers you worthy. Thank you for taking the time to read this story. If you find it meaningful, please like, share, and subscribe so we can continue to bring healing stories to you who have been through more wind seasons than anyone else. See you on the next journey.